fabulous. Thanks so much, Sue. I must say, I mean, I think I speak quickly, but that was brilliant in terms of the amount of information you managed to get across in that period. And I have to say also just fascinating, and how nice to get a sense of so much of a collective, so much of a community, so much of everyone working hard and sharing and supporting. So really, really lovely to hear that. Thank you. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining this afternoon. 2 o'clock. I hope that means that you've had lunch, you're refreshed, you're raring to go, full of concentration. There's obviously the other interpretation of the 2 to 3 p.m. slot, but we just won't touch on that, will we? So hopefully everyone's feeling, raring to go. Through the session, I'm going to be posing some questions, either for you to think about quietly to yourself, perhaps write down on a pad, or pop in the chat box. So I'll sort of remind you as I ask the questions, but very relaxed. And as Sue said, we'll make sure we leave some time at the end as well for sort of proper questions coming from you guys through to me, and obviously making sure that I've got the time to answer. I'm going to launch straight in terms of, well, before I do, just a very brief bit of background about me. Sue very kindly explained I've sort of do some workshops on which she's had the misfortune of being on the other side of. Actually, my first career was as a corporate lawyer. Sounds a bit strange, doesn't it, moving from being a corporate lawyer to someone who then focuses on mindset and leadership. But actually, sport's been my passion throughout my life. I played tennis and hockey to both representative level, and my first qualification was actually a tennis coach. I did go down the academic route, went down the corporate law route, spent 13 years in that field and loved it, but was pulled back into this area because, as I said, it really is my passion. And I've had the privilege and fortune since 2015, when I set up Sport and Beyond, to work with many of our elite athletes, many of our elite coaches, and many senior leaders across sectors, where I now focus in my day job, sort of giving and delivering leadership coaching. You'll find out a bit more about me as we go through the session as well, but I thought that introduction would be helpful. So to launch, I guess, straight into why I wrote the book, set the context around that, and then what I'm going to try and do in this session is to draw out some insights and some stories that I hope will have particularly relevance to you as an audience. And just one point to make very much as a heads up. The book is theoretically aimed at senior leaders. So as I've learned through the publishing process, you have to have a very specific target market. So my book is called Staying the Distance: The Lessons from Sport That Business Leaders Have Been Missing. In fact, in a way, the subtitle is a bit misleading, because the lessons from the book, particularly the first half, which I'm going to be focusing on this afternoon, really do apply across the board, whatever your role in the workplace. They really do apply for people who want to improve, achieve, and perform, on a long-term basis, and really be able to stay the distance. So hopefully they'll be very applicable, and I'll draw out some useful insights for you guys today. So why did I write the book? Well, I'll launch straight into the situation which really provided the catalyst for me. So take your minds back to the pandemic. A bit dodgy possibly asking you to go back to that period, but I'm going to ask you nevertheless. So take your minds back to the pandemic, and we're about a year in. Now, I live just outside York, and I was on a train down to London for work purposes. It was allowed, I promise. It was one of those periods when we were allowed to travel for work. And like many of us, when we're traveling on a train, I was trying to concentrate on what I had to do in front of me, but I just couldn't stop myself overhearing a conversation between two other women who were in my carriage. One slightly older, one slightly younger. And it was the younger lady's words that first really got my attention. And she was basically saying to her colleague, do you know, the pace at which we're all having to operate at the moment is just far too relentless and not sustainable. Me and my team are not going to be able to carry on working at the level and pace that we've been having to do in order to react to everything going on in the pandemic. And the older woman, I could see her listening to her younger colleague and saying, you're right. It's like we've all been in an enforced sprint, whereas actually work and the working world is definitely more of a marathon, not a sprint. It's just not going to be sustainable for us to carry on. We're going to have to reset. We're going to have to redraw our boundaries to make sure that both us and the teams that we lead are able to really sustain that performance. The reason why that was a real final catalyst for me in thinking it's time for me to write this book is because I had already felt and discovered that there was a real gap in the market. we're very used to drawing lessons across from sport into business and leadership. It's a busy sort of marketplace, and I suspect that many of you on this session have probably read a lot of books that look at those lessons from sport across to business and leadership. There are some brilliant ones. You'll see a lot of them in my background. The thing is, most of them focus on winning or on high performance in the moment. And I felt we'd all been missing a trick, because sport's been showing us all along not just how to improve, perform and achieve, but how to do so over the long term in a way that's sustainable and that ensures that we can deliver consistent results when it really matters. Why did I feel that that gap was one that needed addressing? Well, because everything that we were seeing and reading during the pandemic. So I was at the time coaching a lot of senior leaders who really were reaching burnout. You know, they were at the absolute extremes of their stamina levels, really struggling to keep their head above water. And it wasn't just senior leaders, was it? We had the term the Great Resignation through the pandemic. And a lot of people at all levels in the workplace were really struggling with the expectations put on them and their ability to sustain their performance. So I felt there was a gap that had become quite an acute one that needed filling in terms of those lessons from sport across to leadership that really focused on long-term performance. The other gap that I wanted to fill is equally, if not probably more relevant for this group, which is, as I said, there are some brilliant books out there. Most of them are written by male authors, and most of them feature male teams, male coaches, and male athletes. Now, there are some exceptions, not least Sue and her brilliant book, Game On, which I think I was one of the first to read and give feedback on, and I absolutely loved it. So if you haven't read it yet, please do. So there are people like Sue. There's a lady called Kath Bishop who's also written a brilliant book called The Long Win. There are female authors out there, and there are, of course, books that feature female athletes, teams and coaches, but it's in the minority. So I wanted to really do my bit to try and redress the balance. And so I've made sure that within my book, much as I've, very fortunate to have my good friend Gareth Southgate write the foreword, I wanted to make sure that I've featured as many female athletes, teams and coaches in the book, which I've done, and I'll draw some of that out today. Right, that's the introduction context for the book. As I said, just to remind you, I'm going to be asking questions as we go through, so keep on your toes, please, and there'll be questions at the end as well. First half of the book looks at how you get the best out of yourself over the long term. I wonder how often you think about how you show up to work. What are the attitudes and approach that you walk in the door with? What are the behaviours that you demonstrate? What are the beliefs that you hold? Now, sport's known for a long time that these things make a fundamental difference to your ability to perform over the long term. So what I started to do was to take some of those concepts and lessons and insights and stories that I knew from sport. I started to overlay them with insight and research from the world of work more generally. And some very clear patterns and themes started to emerge in terms of what made the difference around that long-term sustainable performance. I then connected that with what I was seeing on the ground with the senior leaders and others that I was coaching. And it became clear that there were 6 lessons in particular that were very, very relevant, actionable, and hopefully game-changing in how you can get the best out of yourself over the long term. And I'm going to pick up, hopefully, provided we've got time, on 4 of those chapters today, 4 out of the 6, starting with how to find your confidence sweet spot. Now, before I share any more insight, I'm going to ask all of you to do something for me, please. I'm going to give each of you 1 minute. And in that minute, I want you to think about and write down what you feel your 3 greatest strengths are. So what are your 3 greatest strengths that you bring to the workplace? When I say go, start thinking and either write down on a pad, just think in your brain, or if you're brave enough, please do share in the chat box. And the minute starts now. Thank you, Anne. That's great. Another 15 seconds. That's great, Kate. Thank you. Okay, right, I'm going to close that there. Now, if you haven't had a chance to think of your three, please do take this away afterwards if you want to refine or think through a little bit further. I'm going to come back to that shortly, but just on that as well, I wonder how easy you found that. And just to share, there is a piece of research showing that actually men find it easier to both recognize and articulate their strengths than women. So just something to bear in mind when you think about how easy or how difficult you found that process. Confidence sweet spot. So that's where we're starting. As I said, I'm going to come back to that question about greatest strengths. But why do I feel that confidence, and why does the research and insight show that confidence is really important to that long-term sustained performance? Well, we all know some of the pitfalls of confidence, don't we? Where we've got confidence that's too high, that sort of bombastic confidence where you feel you know everything and you can do everything, that stops you looking to learn and develop and improve, because it's like, what's the point, right? I'm really good anyway. That's probably going to mean for quite short-term performance, because at some point you're probably going to get found out. The other end of the scale, though, where you really don't feel you've got any confidence at all, that can be quite debilitating, can't it, in terms of preventing you putting yourself out there, pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, and putting yourself in situations where you learn, develop, and grow. Now, I start this chapter with a story about Dame Kelly Holmes. Many of you will be aware of Dame Kelly Holmes. She won 2 gold medals at the Athens Olympics at the time when we were quite crap at winning medals, let alone gold medals. These days, 2 gold medals doesn't sound great, does it? But in 2004, when she won them, it was extraordinary, especially after a career of injury and sort of mishaps. When asked about what gave her confidence, one of the things that Kelly will often talk about is the fact that she trained against men. So as a junior athlete coming through, and when she was in the army, she spent a lot of time training against people who were bigger, better, stronger, faster. Now, as well as improving her times, what she says about that period is it gave her real confidence to push herself out of her comfort zone and be comfortable in that situation. On retirement from her athletics career, she set up her trust, her charity that works with young people. And back in 2015, they commissioned some research to look at what is it about elite athletes, our world-class athletes, and the way that they approach things that actually enables them to be successful in other walks of life when they leave their sport. And it was reduced down to 5 particular mindsets, one of which was confidence. So we know confidence is important. But what underpins confidence? Well, I'm going to ask another question. You don't have to put up your hands, actually, but perhaps sort of metaphorically in your head. I'm going to ask a question. How many of you can ride a bicycle? And I suspect most people will be able to say yes. How many of you were born able to ride a bicycle? It's not a trick question. So, just think for a few seconds to yourself, how did you learn? What kind of process did you go through to learn how to ride a bicycle? So you tried, you would have put in a lot of effort. You probably failed at times, which would have involved falling over, hurting yourself. That would have given you some feedback, wouldn't it, in terms of I've fallen over, I've hurt myself, or I've hit a wall or whatever, and perhaps the person helping you would have given you some feedback as well. And you were definitely really challenging yourself, weren't you, to try and do something which you couldn't do at the time. But you probably would have had a belief in the fact that you could learn to ride a bike because friends, siblings, parents, etc. were able to. You probably wanted to, because all your mates were and you wanted to catch up with them, or your elder brother and sister. And actually, there was a process that you went through that involved trying, failing, pushing yourself out of your comfort zone and getting that feedback. Now, as I'm talking through, probably some of you will be already making the connection to essentially what I'm talking about there is a growth mindset. Growth mindset is something which probably many of you are familiar with. It's something which has been written about huge amounts, and I'm not proposing to go into lots of detail here, other than to say lots of research. It's a relatively new concept, but it's something that sport's known all along. And it's something which absolutely underpins that confidence. What kind of things go into how you build that, use that growth mindset to build your confidence? Number one, when you think about where you're putting your effort in at work all the time to improve and develop, I wonder how many of you spend more time thinking about your weaknesses than your strengths. In other words, how many of you put more development time into the things you're not so good at rather than the things you are already good at? And I'm going to share a quick story from the world of tennis to demonstrate what I mean. Some of you may be familiar with the name Steffi Graf, one of the best tennis players ever, one of the most amazing people to watch on telly. She managed to win, and I can't remember the exact number, apologies, it's in my book, but a large number of Grand Slams. She had an incredible record, and she did all of that without being able to play one of the fundamental tennis shots in tennis. Just to repeat that, she did that without being able to play one of the main shots in tennis. She could not play an attacking backhand in matches. She practiced it in training, but come to a match, she could not play an attacking backhand. She just played a defensive slice backhand all the time. Did it hold her back? No. Why? Because with her coaches, she focused on her strengths, which were her serve, her forehand, and her incredible footwork, which enabled her to get round lots of her backhands onto her forehand. So number one, think about understanding and recognizing what your strengths are and really working to leverage those. Number two, consolidation. When we think about improving and development at work, there's a lot of emphasis put, isn't there, on continuous improvement. But I'm going to share a quote from Mel Marshall, who's one of the female coaches that I feature quite a bit in the book. She's coached to Adam Peaty and a host of other Olympic swimmers, and she's the most remarkable woman. And talking about consolidation, this is what she said. I should have put my sticky in the right place, shouldn't I? Here we go. People may think that my focus with Adam is on continuous improvement. But what I've learned is that it is really important to periodize growth. There is a certain amount of time that you can be in your grow zone, but unless you spend some time in your no zone, then actually you've not consolidated and started to use the learning that you've acquired. So a really important point there, I think, that despite the appropriate focus that we should be having on that continuous improvement, if we really want to stay the distance and sustain our performance, don't forget to carve out time to consolidate and to build on and to practice the things you're learning. The final point I want to make on this area of confidence before I move on to the next area is around comparison. Some of you may have heard the quote, "Comparison is the thief of joy." And I want to help you understand how you can make comparison or competition your friend rather than your enemy. And there's a very simple trick to this, which is comparing with or competing against yourself rather than others around you. If you constantly focus on trying to be a little bit better each and every day, that's going to guarantee that you are building, developing, improving in a way which isn't going to either give you a full sense of, do you know what, I'm wonderful because everyone around me is much worse at X, Y, Z, or I'm just not good enough at all because everyone around me is much better at X, Y, Z. If you focus that comparison competition on yourself, you're definitely going to be able to make it your friend and help yourself stay the distance. I'm going to move on to the second area now. The second chapter in the book is called How to Leave Behind Fear. And to set the scene, I'm going to explain where the idea for this area and chapter came from. Some of you may have been to Lord's, the home of cricket, and some of you may have even had the opportunity to go into the long room. Now, the long room is a sort of key room in Lord's. And up until I think it was 1999, the only women who had ever been allowed into the long room were cooks and cleaners and the Queen. That was it. It was completely no-go area for any women, let alone any women in sport. Thankfully, that changed in I think it was 1999. And, you know, over the next few years, you started to see a few women being allowed in. In 2016, that trickle became a temporary flood because there was a Women in Sport event run in the room on that date that was sponsored by an organisation called Investec, and that was there, really, the day was there to discuss some research which had been done to look at the benefits that playing sports as a young woman and as a young girl and a woman give to women when they're then in the workplace. Now, I was very fortunate to be on the panel for that day, and one of my panel colleagues was a lady called Dr. Hannah McLeod. She had recently come back from Rio, where she had won a gold medal as part of the GB women's hockey team. And she gave some brilliant answers to lots of really good questions that we got during the day. But the answers that really stayed with me was when she talked about how coming through the ranks as a hockey player, she'd either not been picked or dropped at pretty much every single age grade that she went through. So either not picked or dropped. This is somebody who ended up then playing in 2 Olympics and winning an Olympic gold. And it got me thinking about fear and disappointment and the relevance of that to long-term performance. At the time, I was reading a book called Legacy, written by a chap called James Kerr about the All Blacks. Some of you, again, may have heard of that. Really good book. One of the chapters looks at fear and actually trying to emphasize the benefit of fear to performance. That didn't sit with me. It didn't really sit well with what Hannah was saying. And this was reinforced to me even more when I read about the work and heard about the work that Dr. Pippa Grange was doing with the England men's football team when Gareth took over. And she did a big piece of work there to really help the players leave behind that fear that wasn't going to be helping them in any way to really make sure they could drive that sustained long-term performance. Now, one of the pieces of research I refer to in this chapter is an academic piece of research done around entrepreneurs, where they actively, consciously tried to find some beneficial links between fear and short-term performance in entrepreneurs. And whilst they found some links, they were really only about short-term performance. And they found that actually the downsides of stress, worry, concern, and all those kind of things pretty much outweighed any short-term benefits. So leaving behind fear is definitely useful and important for sustained performance. What I'm going to ask you now, and again, either just think quietly in your heads or write down or pop in the chat box, whatever you're comfortable with. What is it that you think you fear in the workplace? And I'm going to give you a minute again, starting now. So what do you fear in the workplace? Thank you, Natalie. Thanks, Anne. This is really useful to see. Those who are happy to share, thank you. Yeah. Okay, well done, everybody, and particularly for those for sharing, because it's quite a personal thing, isn't it? I'm going to share with you, actually, that there have been 7 fears identified in sport, and you'll recognise some of the things from what's in the chat box, and also you may have been thinking. And obviously, these are in the book. So fear of not being good enough, fear of failure, fear of the unknown, fear of being judged, fear of not meeting expectations, fear of success. Actually, that one being, oh my gosh, I'm doing so well, this can't be right, I'm going to get found out, something's going to go wrong. And fear of injury or re-injury. That's obviously a sport-specific one. Well, depending on what your roles might be, it might be relevant to your roles as well. So just, quite useful to see the ones that have been identified from sport and actually how analogous they are to the ones that you've identified, both in the chat box and I'm sure that you were thinking about. We could spend a lot of time talking about fear, but I want to just give a couple of practical insights to start with. Number one, where we have a fear that we find is a constant companion. So, sometimes we can just ignore fears, can't we, and just carry on. But where we have one that seems to be a constant companion, it's actually better to recognize it, to sort of, face up to it and accept that it's there. Don't brush it under the carpet, but accept that it's there. Now, you can do that in all sorts of different ways. You might be talking to a friend, you might be talking to a coach, a mentor, a colleague, a partner, whatever. But it is important that we do face up to those fears that actually do seem to be a constant companion. The second point to note, though, and this is the critical one, once you've done that, the trick is to have a simple shift. Rather than obsessing over that fear, rather than constantly thinking about what it is you're trying to move away from, just twist it. What is it that I'm trying to move towards? What is it that I'm aiming for? And that's where you should be driving your self-talk and your thinking in this area. Now, in the book, I share a fascinating example from Jeanette Quarke. Many of you will be familiar with Jeanette, an ex-runner who now does brilliant broadcasting around athletics. There's a really fascinating story on the eve of an event that she was running in. I think it was a World Championships, where her coach gave her just a very simple tool and insight to help her do that shift. So rather than obsessing about what she was moving away from, which was, I'm going to fail, I'm not going to run fast enough, I'm not going to do well, to actually what it was that she was moving towards. And for them, it was a focus on what the newspaper's going to say tomorrow. And she said the newspaper's going to say Jeanette Quarke breaks the British record. And that's what she put all her thinking into. And lo and behold, that's what she did. So a simple trick, appreciate like lots of simple tricks. It's not easy. You've got to practice, but it can really, really help leave behind fear. And just to reinforce this area a little bit more, I'm going to pick up on a particular area of fear, which is around perfectionism. Now, just a quick straw poll, perhaps just put your hands up if you think you're someone who's got perfectionist tendencies. Just having a quick look. Okay, so not too many from people who have got their cameras on, which is absolutely brilliant. So I won't spend too much time on this, but just to say, many people do have perfectionist tendencies. There are certain professions like my old profession, the legal profession, where there tends to be quite a high concentration. And actually there is an elite sport as well. People tend to either wear perfectionism as a badge of honor, it's great, I'm a perfectionist, or wear it as it's a real problem, I'm a perfectionist. Actually, there's a nice middle ground, and the research is showing that there's a distinction between two types of perfectionism. One is perfectionistic strivings, and one is perfectionistic concerns. Perfectionistic concerns tend to be more problematic. This is where the way that your perfectionism works in you is that it really is quite debilitating. It really stops you doing things. So, for example, in the workplace, you might recheck an email over and over and over again before you send it out, or even once you've sent it, go back and look at it over and over and again. Or if you're putting together a document or something to go up to your boss, you just keep looking at it to make sure that it's correct. That can be problematic. Perfectionist strivings, on the other hand, tend to be slightly healthier. Really, really high standards. You really want to do well and you aim for excellence, but you appreciate that sometimes good enough is good enough and it's not always going to be perfect. How can we shift from someone who's got a tendency towards the perfectionistic concerns to the perfectionist strivings? Again, focusing on what it is that you're aiming for. Aiming for excellence, aiming to do your best, but understand that it's not always possible due to the circumstances that you might be in, the time pressures on you, what else is going on in your life, etc. So you're aiming for excellence, but understanding not always possible. Third area, and I appreciate I'm going through relatively quickly, but I hope this is an okay pace in kind of sharing insights and leaving time for questions at the end. So the third area I want to look at is how to leverage the power of your emotions. I start in this chapter with quite a well-known story about Sir Chris Hoy, who was on the start line in the World Championships in Stuttgart in 2003. Now, it was the 1 kilometer time trial, and he'd won the year before. So he was the reigning champion. He'd also won a silver medal at the Sydney Olympics. So he was, already a really good cyclist, world champion on the start line. Everybody expected him to win, and he had a shocker. Why did he have a shocker? Because he went last. The fastest person went last for the last round. And because he went last, he watched what everyone else did. And everybody executed a very, very different race plan from the one that Chris had worked out with his coaches. And rather than staying calm and sticking to his plan, he let his emotions hijack his rational brain. He metaphorically threw his race plan out the window, went out much faster than he'd planned to, and consequently raced a slower race and came in fourth. Now, one of the really interesting things about that story is that it prompted Chris Hoy to go and find a sports psychologist, Dr. Steve Peters. And actually, Chris was one of the first elite athletes to do so, and therefore setting a really good example for so many other athletes to understand how important emotions are to our performance. As in sport, the same in the workplace, isn't it? Our emotions really have an impact on how we're feeling, not just every day, but our ability to control our emotions have an impact on our ability to really perform over the long term and stay the distance. Now, during the pandemic, certainly, and probably for most of us a lot of the time, who's the person we spend most of our time talking to? It's ourselves, isn't it? Self-talk is talked about so much in the world of sport. Why don't we talk about it more in the world of work? Because it's still so fundamentally important, isn't it? So a couple of tips and tools about how we can really leverage our emotions, try and regulate and control our emotions to really drive our performance rather than having that what's called the amygdala hijack and let our emotions hijack and hinder our performance. Number one, we're all going to feel different emotions about different things. It's not sensible to try and cut out emotions, say I mustn't feel X, Y, Z. You know, it's natural to feel emotions. We feel them for all sorts of sensible biological and physiological reasons. But one of the best ways that I've learned to make sure that I really leverage them is to imagine that the first emotions you feel are like a first sketch. So imagine you're trying to draw something and you do a first sketch. You're not going to keep everything from that first sketch, are you? Some things in that sketch are going to be rubbish. And by the way, if it's me, it really would be rubbish because I am a terrible, terrible artist. So you're not going to keep everything from that first sketch. You're going to discard a whole load of stuff from that first sketch that isn't useful, but you're going to keep the bits that are going to be useful for what you're trying to produce as an end result. Same with emotions. Let your first emotions wash over you, but then think about, do you know what? This particular emotion isn't helpful. Anger, jealousy, envy, whatever it might be, not useful. But this emotion, excitement, whatever it might be, actually, you know, feeling challenged probably is useful and so useful to keep. So that's the first tip. The second one, I used the language there, challenge. And there's a lot of work in sports psychology around a threat mindset versus a challenge mindset. A threat mindset where we see something as a threat that makes us anxious, tense, that narrows our field of vision and thinking, versus a challenge mindset where we are open, we are alert, we are excited, and we see something ahead of us as an opportunity to grow and develop. So trying to move yourself from that threat mindset to that challenge mindset can have a real impact on how we leverage the power of our emotions. And I'm going to share a quick piece of research that gives you a bit of a clue as to how to do that. So some researchers at Harvard Business School came up with what they felt were 3 of the activities which were most likely to produce what they call pre-performance anxiety. These were karaoke singing, doing maths problems in front of people, and public speaking. So karaoke singing, doing maths problems in front of people, public speaking. Wouldn't be surprised if even using those words and making some of you feel nervous. Certainly the maths problems in front of people does for me. And they wanted to try and understand whether they could move that sort of pre-performance arousal, which was anxiety, into something that was more useful and that would produce a better experience. So they had 2 groups of people, and they said to the first group of people, your self-talk needs to be, I must stay calm, I must stay calm, I am calm. And to the second group, they asked them to say to themselves, I am excited. And they asked them to say that to themselves over and over again. Lo and behold, from the base level of performance, when they weren't given any instructions, to the second time round, when you had the calm group and the excited group, as you've probably guessed, the group that said to themselves, I am excited, performed so much better. And from a physiological point of view, they had much better results. Why? Because they'd moved into that challenge mindset. Okay. There's lots more in that chapter as well in terms of how to move and how to really leverage the power of your emotions, but hopefully that's some useful things to have picked out. Before we move, I'm conscious of time, to final chapter I want to pick up on, how to prioritize your time. And I'm going to start with a quick question back to you guys. This is one just for you to think about. I'm going to give you 30 seconds and I want you to think and see if you can write it down if you've got a pad in front of you. Can you define your role in 1 or 2 sentences? So can you define your role in 1 or 2 sentences? Off you go. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Again, if you haven't had time, please do try and do it after. It's something which it sounds like should be quite easy, doesn't it? But trust me, I ask a lot of people to do this, and often you get a lot of scratching of heads and and a paragraph, and that's not 2 sentences. So it can be quite difficult, can't it? It is, however, absolutely critical to be able to be that clear on what your role is in order for you to really prioritize your time. And in this chapter, I start with a great story around Jess Ennis-Hill and the absolute superpower she has and had in this area. I talk about, London 2012, when she was on all the billboards and all that pressure, and how she still managed to win a gold medal. But actually, that wasn't her superpower. Her superpower was her ability to absolutely prioritize her time. Jess was very clear when she was competing about what she needed to be doing in order to achieve what she wanted to achieve, which was to be the best athlete she could be. She was able to show up to different things, be absolutely focused on what she was doing, and then go away again. She knew very clearly what to say yes to and what to say no to. And if you think of that period around the Olympics, just think how many things would have been sort of put to her to spend her time, and how many things that she and her team had to say no to. So that absolute clarity on understanding what your role involves, and therefore what you should be saying no to, and how to do so in the right way, in a way that's respectful, etc. Absolutely key. One quick tip for people who find it hard to say no. Well, 2 tips. The first is to give yourself almost a script. Or some pointers. So I've got a workstation at home where I am now. I've got lots of post-it notes all over the place. And one of them is a little reminder of what things I should be saying yes to and what things I should be saying no to, along with a script around a nice polite response for why you're saying no. So that's one tip. Another tip, for those of you who find it really hard to say no, particularly people pleasers amongst you, build in a pause. Thanks for asking me to do that. Can you give me 24 hours while I just go away and check my commitments and work out whether I think I've got the right time and resource to do this properly? So if you build in that pause, it can really help, particularly for those of you who find it hard to say no, just to give you that time to give yourself that space to be able to say no if that is in fact the appropriate response. So something to be aware of there. The last thing on this area, and as you can imagine, there's quite a lot in this chapter, but one of the things I pick up on in this chapter is that managing your energy is actually really important to how you prioritize your time. And particularly through the pandemic, and because we're still doing lots of work things this way through Zoom and Teams, etc., it can be hard to manage your energy, can't it? So a couple of very quick tips. When I'm coaching senior leaders, I often get told, Catherine, I'm so busy that I can't do X, Y, Z. X, Y, Z being going to the gym, having a walk, going for my morning run. I say to them, and I'm quite sort of blunt on this, shift it, twist it. I'm so busy that I must make time for ABC, whatever it is, going to the gym, going for a run. Because if you're that busy and if you've got that much on and you want to sustain that performance over the long term, you have to prioritize your well-being and your energy. And therefore, those things become absolutely critical. The other quick tip is around micro breaks. There's a really fascinating piece of research I was shared from the world of tennis, which explains why every single tennis player now at the end of each point turns their back, has their towel, resets, and then turns back to the court. And it's looking at little short micro breaks, which again, we can build in through our working day, whether it's, Zoom calls that finish at 5 to or 25 past, to make sure you've got that 5-minute break, or whether it's in your half-hour lunch break, making sure you stretch, you go outside, whatever it is, to build in those little micro breaks on a daily basis. And just think of the consolidated long-term impact that has on your ability to manage your energy and therefore work really well over the long term. I'm mindful of time. I really hope that was helpful. There's obviously lots more in the book, but I'm really looking forward now to answering some questions, which we've no doubt got coming in.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Catherine. I really, really appreciate your time. I love that Kate's put a question in there. I realise I find my pause in things by saying to people, actually, I'm just going to go and check with Kate. And it isn't always Kate's decision, but I think I've done that my whole working time. That's almost where I have subconsciously found that, is I'll go and chat with my colleagues or chat. It's nice to have somebody that you can go back to, even though you're not really going to ask them, but it gives you that opportunity to reflect and reply on email. It's easier sometimes.
Good. That's a good example to share. Thank you.
So Kate has asked there, how any advice for how you would say no without just delaying the problem and pushing it down the road? And again, I think we're probably speaking from experience here of trying to decline, but actually just saying, we do a lot of the whole, can we come back and talk to you in the autumn, or perhaps come back to us in the spring? And then invariably people do come back in the autumn and spring. So
yeah, so I think and it's human nature, isn't it, to try and not sort of cut off too much. So I think a couple of things on that. Again, a bit of time writing down and understanding what your priorities are and what are the principles behind the things that you should be saying yes to, and actually clarifying and articulating those to yourself can be really helpful then in your kind of decision matrix around, is this something that we should be doing? And is this something, and if so, should we be doing it now or should we be doing it down the road? So that can help you think, well, okay, it's in this category, we should be doing it. The next thing is timing. So those might be the ones you go back and say, really interesting, but can you get back to us in the autumn? It will also help you there to identify the things that, do you know what, they're just not. And so better to be kind to everybody, actually. And it's also showing respect to the people who have approached you, isn't it? To say, sounds really interesting, not for us, best of luck with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that sounds easier in theory than in practice, but I think that kind of process can help.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And fantastic question from Kira there. How can you help to instill and maintain the growth mindset in a younger team that are evolving?
Yeah, so that's such a good question. In the second half of the book, when I look at how to get the best out of those you lead over the long term, one of the chapters looks at how to develop people in a long-term way, and specifically looks at how you try and embed and instill a growth mindset culture within your organization. There is a brilliant case study from Microsoft to help, and just to give you a bit of a story behind that. Satya Nadella is the third only ever CEO of Microsoft. They've only had 3 CEOs. He's the current one, and he has, transformed the fortunes of the company. Interestingly, he has a child who has special needs. And so when his child was young, he learned about growth mindset through the support and that his child was getting in the education sector in America. And he was like, hang on a minute, our business needs to know about this growth mindset thing, which is in education and in sport. It needs to be in even our massive company, Microsoft. And he managed to work really hard with the team around him to instill and embed in a growth mindset culture. There's obviously a lot around how you do it, and I can't really give a sort of quick answer, other than if you orient everything in your organization to learning, that really, really helps promote a growth mindset culture, because basically what you're talking about growth mindset is that constant focus on improving, developing, and understanding that sometimes things are going to go wrong. So if you orient and frame everything as learning and developing, then that's going to really help.
Thank you. Sorry, actually, Kira, I should have had you come off and ask your own question there. I didn't need to ask that for you. Sorry. Shelley makes a really interesting point. Shelley, do you want to just mention what it is you've, without summarising all that you've put in there, but in terms of active breaks and how that's worked for your organisation?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, obviously we recognised that everybody was sat down at their screens for like so much longer than if we were out and about at meetings. So we introduced a simple concept called Active 30. So on top of like we get an hour lunch break, but on top of that, we basically said to staff every day, 30 minutes, whenever you want to plug it in to do whatever you want, walk the dog, go for a run, I don't know, do some workout in your garden, whatever that might be. We've basically said, you know, take that time for yourself. We've sustained that since, and actually what we do see is that when kind of senior leaders within the organization commit to this and talk about doing it, it really does empower the rest of the team to do it. Because I think what we're saying is, like, if we're really busy people and we can do it, then there's kind of no, you know, you can prioritize it too. So I think it's been really positive for us.
And that role modeling is so important as well. So that's such a good example to share. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah, and Rachel's saying she's had something similar too, but thank you for sharing that. Anne, did you want to ask your question?
Hi, thank you. Thanks for your talk, Catherine. It's really helpful and interesting. My thoughts about, I'm somebody who can often see new opportunities or connections where maybe others can't identify them, and my attention is naturally drawn away from the routine business as usual into new and exciting opportunities that usually involve linking people or linking ideas up. I then struggle to know how to prioritize against my clearly identified and focused priorities amongst the new and exciting ideas, which maybe is something only I could see or I could do or I could initiate, I believe. How do we go about balancing that? Any advice on that approach, please?
I'm smiling at that question, Anne, because it's such a common problem and it's something that I fall foul of as well. So I think I'll start by saying, and there's a great quote along the lines of a company without a strategy is a company that's willing to do anything. In other words, you do need to have, you know, some kind of strategy in place or some kind of articulation of your strategic priorities that enable you then to make decisions about whether things sit within those or not. So definitely, you know, time is finite. Everything we do has an opportunity cost, doesn't it, in terms of time? So we have to always think very clearly about what we're doing and what we should not be doing. Sometimes it's quite useful to write a list of the things that we should not be doing, as well as our to-do list. But understanding your strategic priorities and therefore seeing if opportunities fit within. Now, you've raised an interesting point, though, that you might see things that may, you know, you might have written a plan at the beginning of the year, and there might be opportunities through the year that maybe don't fit perfectly within that because you hadn't sort of seen them. They were maybe unknowns or whatever. So I think the way some companies deal with this, and it's probably worth thinking about it on an individual basis as well, is the 80-20 principle. Now, that principle gets used for so many different things. I always think it's one of the things that people say in meetings, oh, the 80-20 principle. And, you know, everyone's meant to understand it and no one's allowed to ask a question. But you know what? It means all sorts of different things to all sorts of people. Why I'm bringing it up here is that some businesses say, right, 80% of your time I want you to focus on your job, and we're going to give you 20% of your time to focus on new ideas, things that you're reacting to that have come in unexpectedly, etc. That might be a framework possibly that you might use, where you're making sure that 80% of what you're doing fits within your plan, your strategic priorities, but you're giving yourself maybe that leeway to spend some time without feeling bad or guilty on some of the new stuff that you think is worth pursuing that's come in.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I think there were lots of us were nodding on that whole chasing the new shiny and not focusing on the things that need to be done. Catherine, thank you so much. That has been just brilliant. And I think it's, I say, definitely sparked some thoughts and thinking for others. It certainly has for me, and I'm sure for other people too. So we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. And thank you to everybody that's asked questions and been involved. And I hope you've enjoyed those learnings. And as I say, we'll share the recording of this later, probably when it's going to come through in the next couple